of course, the new novel that we're talking about is your debut novel, Everything the Darkness Eats, which, of course, for everybody watching this, I'll post a link down below so you can make sure that you do yourself a favor and grab a copy, and also click the link too with about Eric so you can check out everything else that he's written. Because speaking of which, even though you've been doing this writing thing for a little while, you've been kind of gifting us with several novellas up to this point, at such a frenzy that I guess the first long question for me to ask Eric is like, where the heck did you have time to fit a novel in there with everything else you were writing?
Yeah, no, I totally get, like, the way publishing works is it's a slow process, but I'm quite prolific with my, creative process, and it can look impressive to other people, like, on the outside. You know, Publishing can look really daunting on the outside looking in. But because it moves so slowly, I have projects written now that won't come out for another 3 or 4 years. But I will say, with Everything the Darkness Eats, that particular book was written like January 2021. So it was actually a couple months before Things Have Gotten Worse came out and kind of,
Okay.
had the viral breakout that it had. But writing that novel was a really cathartic experience for me. Writing Everything the Darkness Eats, I mean, I was just, really enamored with the idea of coupling small town story with, like, unimaginable cosmic horror and cosmic dread and, like, existential dread, all of those interesting things. And it was actually my manager that really inspired me to pursue writing this piece, because prior to writing this novel, I really hadn't dabbled in writing novels at all. Like, pretty much everything I had written was a short
Uh-huh.
story or, novella length. And I met my manager like end of 2020, and he wanted to sign me and wanted to work with me, and I told him, like, I don't have any novels at the moment, like all I have are like novellas. And he told me, like, once you get a novel under your belt, once you have that novel manuscript, then we can go out to agents, and I can help you more with that. So he kind of like kicked me into high gear, saying that. And, I dedicated the book to my mom, but really, in hindsight, like, I probably should have dedicated the book to my manager, Ryan, because he really put a fire underneath me and really said, like, I think you should go outside of your comfort zone. I know you write short stories. I know that you're really, interested in novella length work, but I really think you could benefit from writing a full length novel. And I really wanted to work with him, and I trusted him, and I still trust him. He's still my manager to this day. So I really have to thank Ryan for, putting my, getting me motivated to write like a full length novel, as opposed to just working, in the novella territory. And I suppose some could argue that this particular book like straddles the line between novella length and short novel length. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, like, I would call this a first novel. It's a short novel. It's probably
100%.
it's no shorter than like Brian Evanson's Father of Lies, which I think is a phenomenal first novel. That was Brian's first foray into novel, being a published novelist. And Brian actually gave us a really lovely blurb that we're going to use for the cover art for the final version of
Awesome.
Everything the Darkness Eats. So that's a long-winded answer of, how I found the time to write the novel, and just like the process, and what kind of motivated me to work in this space when I had been previously just working primarily for novellas. But that's not to say like I won't go back to working in the novella territory. I feel like horror works really effectively in short form because it's really
Right.
hard to sustain dread for 300 pages. There are peaks and
Agreed.
valleys. It's really hard to sit down and really immerse yourself in a world that you can read in like 120 pages. I've had some people say that they read this in one sitting, this particular book, Everything the Darkness Eats,
Yeah.
but I mean, you could break it up. But I personally love those experiences of reading where you sit down and you just completely lose yourself in the world and you
Yeah.
completely just surrender to the author's vision and you're just lost in this, you're just transported to this other world in a novella or short story. I think that's really exciting for me as a reader, as a consumer of art.
No, absolutely. Actually, with the style of writing that you do, it's so poignant and so visceral that I'm not I'm not sure I can handle 300 some odd pages of it. I think I would be needing a an even better therapist that I have already. So the shorter stuff is kind of welcome too. What would you say that the story itself for Everything the Darkness Eats, definitely takes more of a I guess a cosmic approach than what your novels have taken so far. Where did the seed for that story first originate from?
Well, other than my manager kind of kicking me to really pursue a novel, the seed for that idea really came from my experiences living in a very small town in Kent, Connecticut, where I grew up. I lived in a very small community, very isolated. It was very, I had accepting people around me. I feel like everybody, no matter how different you are, you do have hopefully some small group of people around you that can like protect you and shield you from the negativity. At least I hope that's the case for most people, and I had that, thankfully. But that's not to say that I didn't face discrimination, bullying, all of the things that come along with being different, someone that just isn't, you know that doesn't fit in to whatever mold is typical in whatever community that you happen to reside in. Um, and I really wanted to explore bigotry in a small town in Connecticut. I thought that that would be a really interesting place to start for this novel, and put my characters through that experience. And I also wanted to explore some of my issues with just like religion and you know just where we fit in the universe, and grief as well, feeling guilt
Mhm.
for doing things perhaps we shouldn't have, or things that were maybe out of our control completely. I feel like a lot of those themes figure really greatly in like a lot of my pieces, but they've never come together and interconnected in a way quite like this before. And I feel like this was actually like the perfect novel for me to start with, like in my career as an author, as a published author. I feel like this is a great starting point for me because it does what I really love to do, in that it marries the supernatural with the human and the visceral. Um, I am always fascinated by people and human beings doing awful things to other human beings, and I feel like that this book has that in spades, but it also has that
Mhm.
supernatural, unexplainable element to it that really hopefully will unsettle readers and force them to keep reading. So that's kind of where the motivation came from, for crafting this particular piece. And like I said, like I feel like it's a great amalgamation of everything I've done previously, and also taking my craft to, a new level.
Perfect. And yeah, and I really appreciate that. And I think this definitely does speak volumes for you as an author who is very, very much honest, very much writing from the heart. And just, you actually gave me a fantastic segue as well. Speaking of inspiration, your character Ghost.
Yes.
I think it's safe to assume that Ghost was a homage to one of your favorite, most inspired authors.
Yeah, no, I mean, that particular character, I feel a strong attachment to. I feel like that character, I kind of identify with that character in a lot of ways, because he has that spirit on his shoulder that's kind of tethered to him, and feeding him that negativity, and feeding him that grief constantly, that guilt, that those feelings of guilt. And I'm someone who, I suffer from
Yeah.
intrusive thoughts, and that kind of self-doubt and that negativity. It's very debilitating at times. And that particular character was actually very, very easy to write, and also very difficult to write, because I found myself inserting myself in a lot of those situations, and really coming to care for Ghost and feeling sympathy for him, while also trying to reflect on my own trauma and my own, issues, my own, shortcomings. And that character and the character of Malik, uh, who is another, prominent figure in the book, I feel
Right.
like those two characters, I've had a lot of readers, a lot of early readers, come to me and say how, just how powerful those characters are, and how, um, they've resonated so greatly with them. So that means a lot to me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, and of course the ghost character I was thinking about was, of course, from when Billy Martin wrote as Poppy Z. Bride in the book Lost Souls. I was thinking there's also a similar character in Their Name Ghost, who's a very strong yet very vulnerable character, and I saw some of the similar parallels.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, I mean, already, like, how much I love Billy Martin, aka Poppy Z. Bright.
Yeah, me
Um,
too.
yeah, Billy is just phenomenal, such an amazing writer. I haven't connected with him as much as I'd like to, but I'm friends with him on Facebook, and
Yeah.
he's just so sweet. And his writing really opened a lot of doors for me, just personally. Uh, Prior to reading his work, I really didn't see queerness uh, explored in horror fiction. It really was Billy's work, writing as Poppy Z. Bright, and Clive Barker's work, both of them,
Right. Yeah.
really just kicked down the doors for me, and really made me think, okay, I can have a place at this table, like at this horror table, and I belong here. Because prior to reading Billy and Clive, I really, quite honestly, didn't know if I was going to be able to work as an openly queer person in horror. I didn't think that my voice mattered. I thought that, editors would turn down my work because it was openly queer. And in fact, a lot of my really early stories that I had published, like, years ago, I didn't include queer characters in any of my pieces, because I
Mm.
was so afraid of rejection. And I wasn't afraid of being who I was, because I was at a point in my life where I was unabashedly queer, and I still am. But I was so afraid, I was so fearful of being rejected for content. And it wasn't until like I really like explored the work of Billy Martin and Clive Barker, and then Kathy Koja, Michael McDowell, like a lot of these just phenomenal transgressive writers that I thought, okay, now I can really um, I can operate in this space. And that was on me because those writers have been writing for years. Like, you know, they were around in the
Sure.
80s, 90s. But me growing up, the stuff that I had access to, I didn't know the words to search for
Right.
like transgressive fiction. Like my taste of horror was very classic skewing. Like I would read like Stephen King, and I would read like Richard Matheson, and I would read, you know, the greats. But they're not like part of my community. You know what I mean?
Right. Great, but limited
So
scope.
it helped when I learned the language that I wanted to speak, like this kind of queer transgressive literature. I was able to really search for it, and I in turn found authors like Clive and Billy Martin writing as Poppy Z. Bright, and that just kind of kicked down the doors for me and really just let me know like I can be whoever I want to be.
That's fantastic. No, I love it, Eric. And I no doubt too that there's going to be a lot of writers, probably already are a lot of writers that are perhaps from a similar background and orientation that are now looking at you as being an inspiration to them as well. And certainly, you know, for anybody who might be going through maybe some of their own unfortunate challenges just because of the way that they're designed to identify as, or you know how they choose to express their life. What would you personally say to them, Eric? You know, I mean, how might they gain the courage and strength to be who they are, no matter what? As it sounds like you've, you know, that's something that you've certainly, you know, been an ambassador for quite some time now. It sounds like.
For sure, and I've struggled with it. I mean, I grew up I had very supportive parents, but even with my very supportive parents, I was still fearful of rejection, and I was still fearful of being who I was because so much of society is built on just heteronormative. And you know, queer, to be queer is considered like the other. You know, you're not typical to the you know, to everyone, which is so unfortunate. But in a lot of
Hmm.
ways, like I've come around to that and I've reclaimed that, and I view my queerness now as like a superpower. Like you know, I walk into a room and I know who I am, and I'm proud to be who I am, and I know that there are people who may not like me for that, but that's okay. Like they're not, you know, not everybody has to like me. Um, to anyone struggling with that and you know their identity, I would say try to find your people, try to find your community as much as possible, because isolation is great because it does allow you time for self-reflection and
Sure.
discovering yourself. I grew up kind of in isolation, and I discovered a lot about my sexuality and my gender because I was alone quite a bit, and that just it made me comfortable with being alone with myself. and and that's important because you really have to first love yourself and love who you are to love other people. I know it sounds like so corny.
It's
um
so true though too.
yeah, I mean, we also learn to love ourselves by being loved by others. That I think is very important to note as well. But I
It
would
really is
say,
full circle.
yeah, yeah. So I would say, you know, take the time to use that time for self-reflection, and then try to find your community. Try to find anyone who you can trust, that you identify with, and build a small community with these people that you feel like you can trust. And you know, you will learn to be more comfortable with yourself in time when you take the time to really reflect, like I said, and also let your guard down and be loved by others. I really, I love the idea of being an advocate and, you know, a voice for people who are marginalized and people who, you know, are queer and, you know, struggling. I love that, and I definitely want to be that for readers, because I had so many role models growing up that I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for those people. And I would say that, you know, also find those role models to anyone struggling. Like, read as much as possible, and read outside of your comfort zone, and read the authors that, you know, are queer, that are, you know, that are marginalized, that are the LGBTQ voices, and you will find the writers that you identify with, and that in turn will create like a little community for you as well. I feel like that's so important, because, like, you know,
Mhm.
growing up, I was super isolated. I lived like on top of a mountain with like no neighbors. My parents and I were like super isolated, and all I had were my books and my writing.
That
But
sounds perfect.
it was great. It was great. I mean, it was lonely. It was lonely
Yeah.
at times, because I desperately wanted human connections, and I wanted to know that there were other people out there like me. And I slowly learned about it when I branched out and developed the language skills to like search for those other authors and those other people that were just like me, you know?
Yeah, no, and that's thank you very much for saying all that. I mean, definitely beautiful, beautiful words, and I think very important words for folks to, you know, to listen to and to consider. And I know, you know, kind of on, I guess, a bit of the flip side, to take that a little bit further, if I may, Eric. You know, for those creatives who certainly do identify amongst the, you know, the LGBTQ community, who maybe might, you know, hesitate to fully express themselves as honestly and as vulnerably as possible within their chosen media. I know you alluded already to some of the challenges that you face, worried about the rejection that you might get from publishers. But what are there any other challenges specifically that you might have faced, and, you know, kind of what do you think got you through those barriers and made you just take that jump and just go forward with your best foot despite some of those challenges?
I mean, I'm still terrified. Like, I still live in fear sometimes of,
Oh,
you know, even though I am openly who I am, you know, there's always that fear of rejection and, you know, not being valued, not being respected. Those fears creep in every now and then. Um, I I would say to anybody, you know, facing those problems, you know, um, it's so cliche, but like, you know, just keep writing and keep creating. And if you're not comfortable expressing yourself as openly as possible, write for you. Like, at the end of the day, like, we should be writing for ourselves. You know, the minute we start writing for financial gain, or where we start thinking like, oh, well, how can I market this?
right.
I really feel like the writing is going to suffer quite a bit. And I always write for me first. I of course think about, you know, my audience and who's eventually going to read this. Am I going to like upset people by writing this? Am I going to do more harm than good if I release this book? But at the end of the day, like, I choose to write these stories because they are moored deep inside me, and I need to put them out, because I would just explode if I couldn't, you know?
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe need to reach that point where putting it out is the only way, you know, you'll be able to survive, where it's like gnawing at you, and you absolutely must put it out. If you're not at that place quite yet, there's no shame in that whatsoever. I would say just keep writing, and just, most importantly, like, write for yourself. Like, write, you know, then, like I said, like the minute we attach anything financial to our work, the work just suffers incredibly.
Right.
So I would just say, continue on the path. It does get very rocky, and just keep being true to yourself, and don't, just protect your mental health as much as possible as well. That's also a really important one.
Right. Yeah. Very good advice. And clearly, the work is, focusing on the work itself is its own marketing tool because clearly that's been working out well for you. I mean, word's getting around your, like you mentioned, your first novella. Things have gotten worse since we last spoke. Went absolutely viral. You continue to pour more work out. So for those listening too, it's not just good advice because it sounds good. You're actually making it work for yourself, and you really are paving the way with what you're saying. So
Thank
I think
you. I appreciate that.
100%.
Thank
And clearly, you've got a big push of folks behind you too. Not only with your publishers, but you did mention, of course, your mom. I I love that you've got a lot of pictures on your socials with your mom and various bookstores. Hold up your books, huge, big, proud grin on her face, which I think is absolutely amazing. Um, assume your mom's read all of your work too. I mean, does she read it and then want to go and like give you a big hug and make sure everything's okay with you? You're not writing about nice things here.
My mom, actually, she is like my biggest fan, my biggest supporter. Both she and my boyfriend read all of my material before it's published. Just I kind of give it to them in pieces, like in chunks. If I'm working on like a big novel or like a novella, I'll give them, the different sections of each of the piece. But
Yeah,
my mom has been so supportive of me ever since I was really little. She's the one that introduced me to horror when I was like 8 or 9 years old. We
mom,
watched Creature from the Black Lagoon, and
nice.
that's still one of my favorite monster movies of all
Yeah,
time.
fantastic.
But she's very proud, and I mean, she tells me she'd be proud of me no matter what, and I know that that's true, because mothers love unconditionally. Um, but yeah, no, my mom actually read an early draft of Everything the Darkness Eats, and I was living at home, like in New Hampshire, at my parents'
Yeah,
house when I wrote the first draft of this, because it was a couple months before Things Have Gotten Worse released, and I
yeah,
moved to Boston with my boyfriend like the month before Things Have Gotten Worse came out. So I was definitely like in my parents' home writing this book like
okay,
January, February. And I would write like maybe like a chapter a day. And I would print out, the chapter at the end of every day. And I would go downstairs and like deliver it to my mom. And she would kind of get them almost like those classic, serials that you would read like in, uh,
oh,
you know,
okay, yeah,
like the pulpy magazines and of like the
yeah.
30s. Like that's what she said it felt like, was like reading, a serialized novel in like a newspaper or something. Um, but she absolutely loved it. I I feel really lucky to have such a supportive and caring mother, and she's been my biggest advocate for so long. So it's really special to be able to dedicate this book to her.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And if I can kind of piggyback off of that a little bit too, Eric, you mentioned about how for Everything the Darkness Eats, you sort of did a chapter a day. Was that similar to how you would have approached your novellas, or was there a bunch of a difference as far as um, I guess your process for writing a novella compared to a novel?
Yeah, so like I said, when I was first writing this novel, I was very hesitant, very apprehensive, because I was so fearful of messing up or taking an incorrect turn somewhere in the process. Like I outlined the novel quite thoroughly before I started writing
Okay,
it. But, there's always the chance that, something will happen, some variable will change while you're writing,
right,
and you need to like go down a different path. And I was so fearful of that happening and not being sure how to handle it if it ever did occur. Thankfully, it did not happen. Like, this was a
Okay.
very smooth writing process for writing this particular novel. And but you know, I would kind of approach each writing session like I was writing a short story.
Okay.
So I would write usually like a chapter a day. So that's probably like between 1,500 and 2,000 words, maybe a little bit more. I try not to pay too much attention to word count while I'm writing, just because like I'd rather focus on the story. But you know, I do try to be mindful of like how many words I'm putting down. It kind of depends on how I'm feeling that day. but
Totally get that.
but yeah, no, I would just kind of explore what I wanted to work on, whatever, you know, section of the story I would be pursuing that day, and I would just approach it like writing a very short contained story. And when I would
Okay.
finish, I would kind of start a little bit of the next scene or the next chapter, just so that I didn't come back to it cold, so that
Okay.
whenever I came back to the draft that I was working on, I wasn't like completely stuck. And I feel like that's been really helpful with me
You
because
already.
I kind of do that. I do that pretty much with every book I write now. Like, I'll work on like a chapter a day, hopefully, if I can get through a chapter. But I'll always try to start writing the next scene. And I actually learned that from watching an interview with Harlan Ellison, who said,
Oh,
you
okay.
know, never, just always quit while you're hot, meaning always stop writing when you're like really in the thick of it, and like, you know, things are just flowing out of you, because when you come back to that later, you'll have an entry point to enter that story again. But if you stop and you're like, you know, you don't know where you're going, or you don't know how to begin this next scene, it's going to be really difficult for you to get back into that same momentum. So I always tried to begin the next scene or the next chapter while I was working on, you know, the section that I had decided to work on that particular day, just to make it easier for myself to kind of come back to it later on, and not lose the flow that I had already established.
I mean, I know. If anything, if anybody's heard anything about Harlan, it's you don't argue with Harlan. So, so
Yeah,
and obviously it worked
exactly.
out well for him too. That seems like good advice. One thing that I'm really curious to know your thoughts on this, because certainly with and you kind of touched on this before regarding when you were growing up, there was certainly as far as literary inspirations, there was a few of them with Clive Barker and Poppy Z. Bright, Billy Martin. Uh, and I think you could say the same is fairly true for anything you might see on television or movies as well, where the queer community, I think it's certainly getting a little bit better, where
Mm.
you're seeing more, marginalized people in various television shows. Not that they're the main the main plot of the story, but they're integrated in with it, which that's reality. So I think that's great that you're seeing that. But for the most part, what is it that you've seen about the way that marginalized queer folks of the LGBTQ community are? How do you see the way that they're depicted in media in general, and what do you think that the media gets wrong about that, and some of the things that you feel that they get right about that you're like, I champion this, keep doing that.
Well, I think it's kind of complex in that, you know, the queer experience is not a monolith. You know, we're not all the same.
Right.
Um, so if I see any kind of art, any kind of fiction or film where it presents the queer community as one particular thing, I kind of veer away from that, or I try to kind of steer away from that
Hmm.
just in watching, consuming art. Um, I don't necessarily like when things are presented in such a way, just because, like I said, like, we're not a monolith. Like, we are varied. We're capable of doing wondrous, magical, amazing things, and we're also capable of doing, disgusting, perverse, awful, awful things to one another. So we are capable. We contain multitudes, just like every other community, just
People are
like every
people.
other
Yeah.
human being on this planet.
Right.
So I think what I'd like to see just more in art and literature, film, TV, whatever. Um, I just want to see more compelling stories with queer characters that run the gamut. Like I want to see the happy stories where things are pleasant, and maybe there is some friction, maybe there's some conflict, and then it does get
Mhm.
resolved. But I also want to see that really bleak and nihilistic and just really confrontational, aggressive, dark fiction and dark media with queer characters in it, because I think a lot of queer community members, I know, like a lot of the younger crowd don't really like that. They think that it's going to like stunt our growth in the overall, like, you know whatever. Like they just don't, they
Yeah.
think it's making us look bad to like other people, other communities. And I just don't agree with that. I think we should be able to tell whatever complex, compelling stories we want to be able to tell. So I just want to see like diversity. Like I want to see all the stories with queer characters, and I think it's fabulous that you have a huge box office sensation like Knock at the Cabin being in theaters now, which is based on
Yeah.
Paul Tremblay's book, and that features a gay couple in that particular story. So I I just am so excited for the future of, queer people in literature and film. I think that, there's so much more to be done. There's so many new territories to explore, so many more taboos to break. I think we live in like really exciting times, and I want to see all the colors
Yeah.
reflected in what I consume. I want to see all the possibilities. I don't want to see just one particular thing, just one drum pounded over and over and over again. I want to hear different things. I just want to experience all of it.
Yeah. 100%. And I think that's a big thing too. That's where a lot of the, um, I guess, phobias. I mean, I guess you could argue as well. Some folks say, well, no, it's not a phobia. You're just an asshole. Where it's, you're not really afraid of, the queer community and that. You just don't understand, or you think that anything that's diverse from your own backyard is something to be feared just because you don't quite understand it. I think that it's fantastic that, like you said, where we are seeing a lot more of those barriers broken down, and that it's more integrated in with some of the other stuff that we're able to see. And I think that's the key too, certainly, is that, I think that's what I would like to see as well, is more of an integration of it all, because that's what we are as a society now. It's we're such a big melting pot. Why not represent that in
Totally.
literature and on the screen and in art?
I like that word, just like integration, where it's like, you know, it's not a queer story, it's just a story.
Yeah,
Obviously, like our queerness does define us. Like it's
of
part of
course.
who I am. It will define me as long as I live.
Right.
But the way in which it's marketed, I want to see it just, I don't necessarily need to have it marketed as like, oh, this is LGBTQ plus,
Yeah.
marketed for that specific audience. It should be marketed, for everybody. And I want it to be, you know as available to the masses. Like I feel like I think that's the future.
100%. Oh, very well said. And to tie that response back in with your book, Everything the Darkness Eats, I think it's pretty awesome that um, there's a real diverse subplots in this book that I think are fantastic. And I think that there's a lot of different people that will enjoy it for a lot of different reasons. I think certainly with the LGBTQ plus community, those folks have come away from it feeling strengthened and I think inspired by the representation that they see in there. And I think folks that absolutely love cosmic horror, there's a bit of that in there for them. People that are maybe a little bit on the fence about religion and how that plays a part in the world as well. There's that in them, and people that just love some just scary balls to the wall things to be afraid of. You've got all that in there too. So I'd like to kind of ask you this question in part. What do you hope that people take away from Everything the Darkness Sees? I'm sure that you've got probably a better explanation for that or even better idea of that than anything I might be thinking of.
I think the one thing I never like to assign a specific feeling or, say unequivocally, I want my reader to leave this book feeling this way,
Right.
because every reader is going to approach this book, have a different perspective, feel different things, and everything they feel is totally valid. However they react to this book is 100% valid. But if I could impose and say I want my readers to feel something at the end of this book, blank, what is it? I would say I would really want each person who reads this book to feel like a semblance of hope at the end of reading it. This is probably it's very interesting because it's a very dark, very unsettling book, but there is, I feel, and like I hope there is a lot of hope in it as well. There's a lot of especially at the very end of it, we go through kind of the trauma of the whole ordeal. We go through the horrors. We go through, the agony, the torture of grief, of trauma, all of that, and we come out on the other side, still broken, still damaged, but able to continue to live. Right. And I think that's how I view life. Like I view life as we're going to be beaten down, we're going to be traumatized, we're going to be hurt by people we love. Things are going to just try to obliterate us. But we're going to keep moving forward, even though it's awful, even though everything is terrible and things are probably never going to be fixed ever again. The damage is done. Things are irreparably broken. But we're just going to keep moving forward and just continue dragging with us the trauma and the grief. But it's okay because we're going to get up tomorrow morning and we're still going to be alive, and that's okay. Like that's enough. That's enough. We don't need to ask any more questions than that. And that's really what I wanted to convey with ending this book. And I feel like it's a great way to end it, and I feel like a perfect encapsulation of how I view life in general, and just how I approach all of my work going forward.
Awesome. Well, there's definitely a lot of fantastic statements in this book, and I think that's certainly the biggest one that I took away myself. Despite all the odds, they still exist, and that's kind of a miracle in itself that deserves gratitude, and that's an achievement.
Totally. I'm glad you picked up on that. Thank you.
Definitely. And thank you very much as well, Eric. I really appreciate this conversation as always. And I look forward to chatting with you again.